Good evening. Welcome to the San Mateo County Dental Society webinar. My name is Nesmar Morales. I'm a member of the SMCDS Leadership Council. Before we get started, I want to review how we will be running this meeting. All participants will be placed on mute. Our presenter will provide a presentation on dentistry's changing workforce composition and the age of digital transformation. During the presentation, you may post a question into the Q&A box. For those participants on your desktop, the Q&A box is located on the bottom of your screen. For those on an iPad or iPhone, the Q&A box should be on the upper right. Please feel free to post your questions, and if time permits, we will go over them at the end. So now let's get started. Tonight's presenter is Christine Sison. Christine Sison is the CEO of Swiss Monkey, a staffing and virtual front office services company. She has built and managed a dental practice for over 10 years. Christine earned her bachelor's in neurobiology from UC Berkeley and a master's in health policy and management from the Harvard School of Public Health. Prior to her work in dentistry, Christine conducted brain tumor research at UCSF, assisted in the integration of IT into clinics and hospitals, and later led the development of community-wide healthcare systems, including telemedicine efforts. Please welcome Christine Sison.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. Thank you for joining me on this Thursday evening. Hopefully you guys are back at home and not still stuck at the office like Ness. But if you are, you're welcome to have a glass of wine. Always makes these kind of presentations a little bit more pleasant and maybe more enjoyable. So I'm here, I think, for the next hour or so to talk a little bit about our work here at Swiss Monkey in terms of what we've been finding in the dental industry, especially as it's been changing with regards to COVID and recruiting and some of the operational pieces. So in terms of kind of our objectives today, I want to discuss how hiring has changed since the pandemic. I think we've all kind of really felt something's been different when we opened up. We'll talk a lot about the hybrid working model and just some considerations and if it's right for you. And then we'll talk as well about the automation and technology kind of advancement and acceleration in terms of what's happening within the industry and why it matters to your practice. So again, I'm from Swiss Monkey. Let me kind of go back to my other slide. And I won't talk too much about this. If we have some time, I'm happy to answer more questions. But essentially what we do is, as Ness mentioned, we're a dental partner organization. We help our doctors build really resilient teams kind of through the use of hybrid models and technology. So let me just start off. I know Ness did a nice little introduction. I'll just kind of do this really briefly again. So I'm a Cal grad here. I went to UC Berkeley, got my master's in health policy and management. I did work as a consultant helping clinics and foundations kind of really integrate IT into their workflows. I think this background is relevant here because I want my doctors to know as we're kind of problem solving within the dental industry, I really look at that to be able to think about how we solve and create really applicable solutions. And also kind of that I'm really steeped into workflows and systems and data as we're developing kind of solutions that I think are relevant for our work. And then my husband also, for those of you who don't know, is also a dentist. I've managed his practice for about 10 years, not as involved, but a lot of the things that we do here at Swiss Monkey has been, whether or not he's liked it, tested into in an actual practice. And so we get some chance to really be able to make sure that what we send out before it gets to you has been tested in some way or form in a dental setting. So let's go back for just a minute. I didn't want to be negative. I was just finishing watching the Back to the Future series, and I saw this. Marty, whatever happens, don't ever go back to 2020. So I know last year, part of us just kind of wants to forget about it. But just for a minute, let's kind of go back and kind of recap what happened. We all closed for 2 to 3 months, reopened, and just a lot of different factors, I think, once we reopened, didn't allow us to get back to full kind of speed right away. And so we had the childcare issues, we had schools, I think especially in dentistry, we tend to have, especially within the front lines, really a predominant workforce around women. And so that obviously kind of, I think, affected the industry, I think, disproportionately. A lot of people didn't come back maybe as soon as we thought they were going to come back. Some of them, there's just some fear. We had people leaving the industry. Obviously, we had different laws and regulations depending on where you were in the country. And then we had secondary and tertiary effects of people actually leaving and moving out of state and whatnot, which obviously affects kind of the supply and demand kind of dynamics, especially when it comes to staffing. And for those that did come back, it felt different, right? I think when we were able to open up, when they said, hey, it's fine for dental practices to kind of reopen, we didn't see, I think, that uptake that we were all expecting to see. And when we did, and for the people that did come back, it felt really different, right? And of those that were back, we're seeing about a 55% of the working population are actively looking for a new job. You'll see this term, kind of the Great Resignation. And of the 55%, we're seeing about a third of them are actually willing to leave their position without having another job in place, which is very different than in the past. And so we're living in this kind of really grand social experiment. And so kind of this collapse of not the collapse, but this kind of the rebuilding of the talent pool as we're opening, I think, is a very complex process. And so, I want to talk a little bit about what happened during COVID. And I promise I'm going to bring some of this back to the industry here. But I think first, it already accelerated things that were already underway, I think, from a macro level, right? And so we had the automation of tasks that were happening across the country. In dentistry, you can think about, things like insurance verification, sending out claims. Those are all things that have started to really penetrate the dental industry. Technology-enabled connectivity and the rise of the gig economy. So you saw kind of platforms like Zoom, right? The ability to even to connect to people not within your kind of close geography definitely was accelerated because of COVID. We found out, when COVID hit, a lot of us became technology companies, even dental practices, right? So we were able to do, some of us even engage in like teledentistry and some more of that type of telehealth-like efforts. We did see the rise of it. We'll talk more about this kind of gig economy. And for those of you who haven't heard that term before, it's basically those individuals who have decided to kind of opt out of that traditional employee-employer kind of contractual relationship, and that they're deciding to be independent contractors. They want more autonomy over the schedule, over their pay. And we're definitely seeing that rise across kind of the industry, not only in the country, but also within the dental industry. And we'll talk more about that. And then societal expectation shifts within millennials and Gen Z. And I think we all knew that when we were kind of hiring. You can feel it in your practice, but I don't think we really had a true appreciation until things kind of opened up, and we're seeing, as we're starting to run our businesses again, man, seeing the baby boomers retire, we're seeing kind of this millennial and Gen Z kind of workforce really come into play, and it's feeling different, which is creating, I think, managers who aren't really used to kind of managing that type of workforce. I think a little bit of just uncertainty and challenge in terms of how to really maximize kind of that team. I think secondary is that what happened during COVID is that we had this really kind of abrupt convergence of people working from home, and there's kind of work-life balance, right? We got to see people's dogs, their children, their homes, and it gave people a chance to really think about, what I want to do with my time, right? You had this kind of zero-sum game balance, and a lot of people had a chance to think about whether or not their work mattered to them and how they wanted to spend their time. And so when this economy kind of reopened, a lot of them opted not to come back. Right. And so I do feel like in many ways, we are still working in a very constrained workforce. I mean, you can see that if you had something to do staffing, and even here, we have people that are very qualified and have the skill set to take on the jobs, but they're opting out of the workforce. They're not ready to come back, or they're just choosing to delay their time, which means, there's definitely some implications there in terms of how do we kind of manage this kind of supply demand imbalance. And so going back to this in terms of the, having people kind of really think about what is their mission and value, a lot of my employers are saying, hey, does that really matter to me as a company, as a practice, as a business? And I guess, no, the answer is, I think shortly, no, it doesn't matter whether or not you're able to help them find alignment. But for those organizations, those practices that are able to help people find alignment, are able to explore alignment, we see that there's a true business case around that, right? So your team is your employees are 6.5 more times more resilient. They're more likely to stay. They're more likely to be excited by work. They report better health, and they're 1.5 times more likely to go above and beyond. So there's absolutely a business case if you can find a way to be able to find kind of your organizational practice alignment and also what people love doing and what their purpose is. There's definitely kind of, I said, you can see below, kind of this huge uplift, kind of this virtuous cycle, if you're able to find that kind of synergy. I think it's important, I kind of put a little note there at the bottom, is that most of the people on the call here, you're kind of on the tail end of, most of us have advanced academic backgrounds, you really think about your work. There's a stuff, we're almost kind of living in this gilded cage, right? Because we're on that tail end of usually the educational spectrum. On the academic spectrum is very cognitive on that side. But for some of our employees, their work is a very kind of real condition. They have to work it. Their vocation is an economic transaction. They need it to be able to pay their bills, right? So they give their work and their vocation a certain amount of real estate in their life. And so I think that's okay, and sometimes, that's what they give us. They give us 8 hours of their day, and it is a practice's opportunity to see whether or not you can use that time to help them find alignment, help them find purpose. And if you can see here that creates some really incredible synergies and benefits to your practice. So just a couple of things here, just some really practical considerations moving forward. So we talked about why finding kind of personal purpose matters. Talked a little about employees and Gen Zs. We tend to find that generation, novelty is very important to them, right? They tend to want to get promoted faster, get paid more. They vote with their feet, which means if they don't like it, they tend to leave quicker, right? They just tend to just change occupations. It's also really interesting, and I think we know this, but we haven't really kind of talked about the impact of social media. This generation is growing up with social media, and when you're growing up around that, you can really enter and exit out of conversations and communications asynchronously, right? You can get onto your email, you can basically send out a text message, you can exit a conversation by pressing a button. And I think that's a very different type of skill set than sometimes what you have in the practice, which is where you need a lot of emotional intelligence. You need the ability to kind of listen and show empathy, right? When a patient's in front of you, you can't just kind of leave like you can with your text message or your phone or whatever it is. And so we are seeing that a lot of that training that maybe happened in the previous generations is now happening inside of the workplace, which I think is different. And it means that some of the burden of training that we usually expected maybe at the home or doing outside, before they got into the business, is now happening within the business, right? And so that requires kind of I think a different managerial kind of mindset when you're thinking about this next labor market. I also want to talk about the rise of the gig economy. I think we see this a lot in the tech side. Maybe we're starting to see, I think, more and more of that within the dental industry. There are lots of now opportunities for people to become more contingent workforces where they can have their own schedule. And that has real implications when you're looking at a traditional resume, right? So I know when we're screening, I think the way that we tend to look at it is we're looking kind of for this continuous work history, right? There's no gaps. And it's going to be interesting as this gig economy kind of, I think, continues to grow, that necessarily gaps in employment, traditional employment, don't mean that they're actually any worse. It might actually mean that they are very talented, right? We see sometimes that we're seeing kind of this hollowing where you have people that are very good deciding that, hey, I don't want to work for one company. I want to be able to be an independent contractor. And I want to be able to set my own rates and move around. And I think that means that for people that are in charge of reviewing the resumes, to be just more thoughtful that how we used to look at resumes and before those gaps aren't necessarily predictive of how talented a person is. I also want to bring up a concept that I've been hearing around, which is called recruiting nihilism, which basically talks about that sometimes all of the interviewing questions and kind of structure that we have don't necessarily mean that it's predictive of how they're going to do in the future, right? And also that the in-person interview has been notorious for not being a really good indicator of how well the person is going to do in the office. And so sometimes you can use your gut, right, and see how that goes as well. I mean, it's kind of a crapshoot. They're just, I think, using some structure is good, but not putting so much weight on it, because we just haven't seen a really strong correlation between like an in-person interview do really, really well and that they're going to do well in the future. There just hasn't been really good data around that. And then thirdly, I think I want to talk about kind of active resource allocation. One of the things that we're also seeing our really successful practices do is to really look very hard at the current team that you have and to figure out whether or not they are the right people to execute your strategy, right? Not, I think most of us are really good at assessing people coming in, like new candidates coming into your practice. We're not very comfortable assessing our existing people, like the incumbents within the position, right? It's just something that we feel like it's almost a birthright. Once they're there, they're going to be in the practice. But I think as owners, we have to really look at, do we have the right talent in the right places? And if we don't, we need to figure out how to move people around, right? And this will kind of bring us into the next segue, which is, if you don't have the right people in the right places, what do you do? And so there are different models. I think with COVID, obviously it accelerated a lot of changes, and it created this kind of really interesting imbalance between supply and demand. And if we don't have talent in-house, can you tap into people outside of your immediate orbit? And we see a lot of industries do that. And with COVID, we've been really, I think, we've had the opportunity to kind of force us to think about new ways of operating our practices that are just as efficient and can actually position to be more competitive in the future. So, here's kind of just at a high level how practices look right now. So you have most of the clinical and operation admin side really happening on site, the check-in, check-out, scheduling, treatment presentation, all the way up to, obviously the clinical stuff has to happen on site, right? Unless you're maybe doing some teledentistry, your billing, your whole revenue cycle, all of that. Most practices tend to keep that on site. Now this hybrid model, we're doing some iteration of it, right? Most of us don't have an accountant on site. We're not, most of us who do have coaches, they're not, on site, where you're kind of using fractional models, marketing, the legal. So those are kind of little micro experiments that this model already works. We're already doing it. I think with COVID now, we're kind of rethinking, are there other opportunities for us to really unlock this, this hybrid model? And so you can start to think about, what can we shift over, right? And so really at the extreme, you can really shift off anything that's not patient facing. Now, just because you can doesn't mean you should. That's not what this model is saying. It's just helping us kind of, if you want to think big, how do you redesign your practice? If you have a very limited amount of people, what kind of tasks do you want them to be working on? And what can you pull off site and have just as effective outcomes, right? And so anything not patient facing, most of the things are the whole revenue cycle, billing, payments, hygiene, recare, verification, unscheduled treatments, reminder calls, all these can be done off-site. And then the kind of even more extreme, if you really wanted to defrag kind of the practice operations, you can pull most of it off-site. Now, it's just it's interesting. We'll have people where they might just use an off-site team to do specific projects, like, hey, I have $500,000 of AR. I just need a team that's going to focus on bringing that down. And on the other extreme, we have practices that have been operating with no front desk at all. Right. And so there's kind of all these different colors in between, and our offices will tend to kind of move pretty fluidly, just depending on what their on-site team's capabilities and talents are. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, also in the next few slides here. So for me, I think the number one reason dental practices should reuse it is just about your ability to be resilient across different staffing changes, right? I have a dental practice as well. Whenever someone leaves or someone moves or there's something happens, it's extremely disruptive. Most of us have just enough people on there when if someone leaves, it's a big deal. And so the ability to have kind of a secondary layer to your practice, one, I think it creates a peace of mind that, like, you can manage this, I think, in a less disruptive way, especially when it comes to the patient experience, than if you had no one. So I think the ability to be resilient over time, I think, is, for me at least, one of the primary kind of nuggets of thinking about the hybrid model in terms of whether or not it's a right fit for you. So I like this quote by Charles Darwin: "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the most adaptable to change." And so, I talked a little bit about, what is the value proposition here around a hybrid model. So one, leveraging the ecosystem and minimizing disruption, right? So the ability to say, hey, yes, you have your on-site team, but if you don't have everyone that you need, you can tap into talent outside of your immediate kind of practice, right? It might be new to you, it might be different, but a lot of other industries are doing it, and those that can successfully do it, I think, position themselves to be more competitive. You can actually, I believe, increase your productivity, and I think is going to be allow you to be able to, I think, manage the whole kind of business side of dentistry, I think, in a much more graceful way. It allows you to refocus and reinvest your energy. I think running a practice when you have, constant staffing turnover, and it might not even be constant as if they're leaving, even if they're gone for a day or two, there's just so much energy that's invested in making sure you have the operations to actually run a dental practice. Now, if I can say, hey, I'm actually going to pull out some of that and say, hey, we're going to keep this kind of this part of your practice very consistent, which just kind of leads into creating a base infrastructure that allows you to say, hey, I don't have to worry about that anymore. Let me just focus on training my 2 or 3 people in the front, maybe around treatment planning or whatnot, or growing my practice, right? So if you have a limited amount of energy, the idea is where do you invest that? And if you're able to use an offsite team to create some stability, some consistency over time, you can then use it to actually grow your practice. And I think more from an industry level, this model allows us to democratize practice operations. So we know that there are some doctors, I'm sure no one here on the call is, that maybe don't love managing a practice. They hate managing people. It's one of the things they feel like they're being taken advantage of, right? They just don't like all of that. And it's interesting if that's the case, using technology, using hybrid teams actually allows you to kind of offload a lot of that task. So now you can actually just be a doctor, right? You don't have to manage all those things. And if you didn't have that option, you might not even be able to run a practice. We have some doctors where just every 6 months, they just lose their entire team, and it is incredibly difficult. And now that we have a hybrid model, we can provide 95% of their team. Boy, they're able to run a practice. I think that's really interesting, kind of from a global perspective. The ability to say, hey, people who traditionally couldn't run a practice now can. So here's a sample adoption process. Where you decide and how you decide to kind of dip your toe in this, if you haven't already done this, depends largely on what the fire is and who your on-site team is. But all things being equal, the way that I like to think about it, if my doctor's like, hey, I'm just interested in starting to really integrate this model into my practice, how do I do that? And you're a little bit nervous, I do just like we do in the medical side, which is you look for kind of low-hanging, low-risk, non-patient facing activities, right? Which means things like insurance aging, some of the billing and the posting. And the reason that is if for some reason, if you decide not to use Monkey, you use somebody else and you're not quite sure and they totally mess it up, you're just, it's just messing up the aging, right? They're just talking to maybe an insurance agent versus like, you might, if you had them start off with like treatment planning, right? Now, if they do mess up or there is an error, they're just not on the same page with the philosophy of care, it's a big deal because now they're doing patient-facing activities that really affect your brand. And so the way that I like to start it off is usually with kind of the lowest risk non-patient-facing activities first, if possible, right? Where we decide to start usually also depends on who my doctors have on site, right? So right now, let's just say if you have an amazing front desk person, 20 years of experience, fantastic. They just need maybe help answering phones, right? Because they can do everything else. That's great. So you might say, hey, Christine, I just need help answering phones and maybe doing some insurance aging. So you might, that's where you might start. Now, if you have someone with absolutely 0 years of experience, you hire, your one person that knew everything about your practice is gone, you might have to start off with some of this other stuff like the treatment planning and auditing the schedule, because that's just where you have the need right away. So a lot of this is very reflexive, right? Meaning that like what happens on site absolutely affects the dynamics of what we do off site, at least here at Swiss Monkey. There is a lot of communication in terms of how we do it here, where it's very, very dynamic. I think that's also that's also as I'm seeing this model kind of evolve across the industry. I think what's really interesting is when people think about hybrid models, we use outsourcing a lot, which tends to be very kind of unidirectional. I think we're really trying to change the nomenclature about how we talk about a hybrid model, in the sense that it can be it should be very dynamic, it can be very reflexive, and that there is a lot of communication between the on-site team and off-site team. And you really want to be able to make sure that we're all on the same page about the philosophy of care, how we treatment plan, et cetera, just so that we're not adversely affecting the patient experience, right? Like our goal here, at least as Monkey, is when you adopt this model, that we are all keeping that experience really sacred, right? I don't want us to become like the widget company. I don't want it to feel like, okay, I'm talking to an answering service. So it also depends on what company you decide to use. But so for us, at least, we're looking at ways to be able to make sure that there's a lot of cohesion between your on-site and your off-site team. I have a little note here as at the bottom, one of the things that's still evolving with the use of kind of these hybrid offsite teams, kind of the contingent workforce, is also performance and management metrics, in terms of how do you now manage a team, like you have one on site, one off site. So I think as we are incentivizing your on site team, you're rethinking about this. We have to also talk about, you want to have incentives and performance measures that help your on site team to think about how do we increase productivity, so that it's in the best interest for everyone to think of models that are just not necessarily tapping into the on-site talent. Because then when you think about it that way, hey, I want to go from $100,000 to $200,000, how do we do that? And they're all kind of, everyone gets the right bonus. They might think about, hey, I don't have enough power, time within my current schedule. But if we tap into someone offsite, that might allow us to be able to hit those goals. And so I think if you create those right incentives and the right metrics, then you can really, I think, be able to establish this model, I think, in the right way within your practice. So a couple of practical implications here. One, it allows your on-site team to focus on activities that have to be done in the office, right? So like I mentioned before, I like my on-site team to focus on revenue generating activities, patient-facing activities. I think the days where you had your office manager, you promote them up and up and up, and all of a sudden the next, for some, I don't know how this happened, but that next promotion up is they're now doing billing and posting, which actually can be something done offsite. Like you don't need to pay an office manager X amount of money to be in a room, not doing patient-facing activities to call insurance. I think those days are now done. I think most of my practices are pushing that offsite and saying, hey, we're going to actually promote you to do things that are helping us build our schedule, build the practice, grow the practice to where we want to go. So those tend to be like learning how to schedule to goal, right side dentistry, treatment planning, things of that nature. I do want to kind of, since I just have, it reminds me here, I think I think when we go into a lot of these practices, there is, I think, a general fear sometimes in terms of when we go in there, whether or not this type of model is trying to take people's jobs away. And I think it is. It's really imperative, not only for companies like mine, but also the doctors, that when we are integrating these types of models into your practice and you're breaking the systems and you're saying, hey, this is what it's going to look like, that we do that in a very sensitive way that acknowledges that, hey, we are not trying to take anyone's jobs away, right? In fact, what we're hoping to do is to allow them to take away some of those route boring tasks that they shouldn't be doing, that they're way overqualified to be doing, and doing things that should be done in the office. And that conversation is really important to have, because you can absolutely drive this model in and say, hey, this is what we're going to do, whether you like it or not. I have found that when at least in our experience, when we do that and we don't have kind of the blessing of the on-site team, it tends to be very, very rocky, right? Like we have to then, we're building trust in a way that I think takes longer. We don't get that synergy and that cohesion as fast as I would like to get. So typically what we do is when we decide to do this with the doctors, we have a conversation about how to be very sensitive about putting this into your new model. Now, some of your office managers might just like, no, this is fantastic, I want to do that. You might not need to have that conversation because they are the ones that have called us and say, hey, I need this help. But if it's coming from the doctor side, I think we want to be thoughtful about what the current kind of mentality and dynamic within the office is, so that we're thoughtful about how we really kind of weave this into your current office operations. Obviously, I think it's more cost effective, especially long-term wise. There's no benefits or employment costs. It will be kind of a pure expense on your P&L. There's the ability to also what I'm calling kind of the fractional staffing. So there are things like a lot of my doctors, they don't need a full-time hygiene coordinator, right? They might be at a size where they just need, hey, Christine, I just need someone to call my hygiene patients 3 hours a week, which is better than nothing, just to help keep that going, right? Especially last year, a lot of our patients kind of off cycle. And so what's nice about kind of a hybrid model is that we can tap into certain hours where we don't need a full-time employee. We can just say, hey, I want to do insurance aging for 5 hours a week, right? Or whatever it might be. So I think especially as a practice owner, something that I like, because I can kind of be really lean on my overhead and just kind of pick and choose based on what I need at that time or wherever my office is. And then limited training required. Usually, I mean, depending on who you guys are going to contract with, for us, we're pretty plug and play. There's some customization because some offices obviously are a little bit different who they're contracted with, maybe some verbiage, but typically it's a much more kind of plug and play model, which is always really nice, especially when you're already understaffed. Right. This is, I think, just a diagram because I want to, as companies like us starting to see more and more, it's, I think, interesting when a practice decides, hey, I'm interested in doing this. How do I do this, right? So this is basically saying on the left-hand side, usually most of the services, hygiene, recare, billing, all of that stuff in the green is done on site. And then some offices might say, hey, I want 3 different companies to do, one to do hygiene, one to do billing, one to do insurance verification, which is not bad or good, but they just opted out to, basically say, I'm going to have 3 different companies do 3 different things. We tend to be more on the kind of the right side of the spectrum where we're what I call a vertically integrated solution, which is like one company and we can kind of do everything that you need. I tend to like that more just because I get to see how things are going from a global perspective, right? If hygiene recare is not doing well, we're able to say very quickly why it's not going well. If there's a billing issue and it's with a patient, everything tends to be, I think, much more streamlined and efficient versus having to coordinate across multiple different organizations. And so you want to be careful. I think I have another side where you tend to over specialize sometimes, because sometimes when you have too many people doing very segmented pieces of a workflow and no one is taking a look at the whole thing, you miss pieces, right? And so you want to make sure at least someone is aggregating the data, taking a look at the whole workflow so you're not making mistakes. Because when it's too fragmented, if someone makes an error in one certain thing, if no one's looking at the whole thing, it basically will have this kind of domino effect, but no one will know where it came, basically where it originated, because they're so focused on their one piece of the workflow. So again, Swiss Monkey does, this is just an example. So we do everything here from hygiene recare, answering phones, billing and posting, insurance and patient ER. We do a lot of special projects. There's some credentialing. Some of our doctors, they change practice management softwares and we have to migrate the data over, auditing a schedule. So really when a doctor comes to us, we think about what are their specific needs first. And we typically end up building from the 1 or 2 services that they decide to start off with. All right. So if you are thinking about doing this, just a couple of things that I've found to be really helpful, especially as we are working with our doctors, is that we have something called the refinement period, which depending on the service usually takes anywhere between like 2 weeks to a few months, depending on just what services you're doing and how involved we are. And essentially think of when you're doing one of these models, it should be an intentional kind of deliberate decision that you're going to say, hey, I'm going to actually break my operations. We're going to rebuild it. So we're going to have some resiliency over time. And which that really means that the first few months, it's going to feel like you're onboarding an employee, right? So you have to be very flexible about, okay, what's going on? Who does what, who does this? And a lot of that feels, I think, sometimes a little bit rough for doctors and their on-site team because you want it to be just a plug and play model. It's not. And part of it is like, if you are committed to the process, you'll start to see the real value once you get in there, once you have the offsite team really know your practice. I think that's where the real value comes in. And what's really cool is that once you have invested the time for the offsite team, especially here, it's like once you've invested the time for me to really know your practice, let's just say you ever scale back. If anything ever happens where someone leaves and you're like, hey, Christine, I don't want to do it anymore, but then someone leaves, you can call and say, hey, Christine, actually, I need that back. And it becomes much easier because you've already invested the time. I know how you like to schedule. I know what insurances you're contracted with. It tends to be a much kind of the on-ramping period is much faster than it was initially, but there is some initial ramp up time where you're really starting to build cohesion and trust, which is just really hard to rush. It just takes some time. I mentioned it's highly reflexive. One of the things really interesting is that when you use this kind of model, it actually ends up tightening a lot of your systems, and it highlights things that are weak. So for example, for us, like when you use our dental receptionist department where we are scheduling new patients, hygiene reservations, one of the things that we find is that your schedule has to be really tight. Like we need to know where you want your new patients, how you schedule emergencies. And some of my doctors are like, oh, just put them wherever. It doesn't matter, right? And so what ends up happening is now, because we have so many people touching the schedule, it can feel really sloppy. And so we tend to use more blocks. We tend to be much more systematic, which as an owner, I like, right? Because then we know exactly how we're scheduling to go. Obviously there's, it's a system. It's not, you don't have to schedule people there, but it allows, I think, certain areas in your workflows to be much more tight, because there's so many now, not so many, but different people touching the same accounts. So documentation has to be really tight. People have to make sure that they're putting in the notes what they told the patient, what the co-payment is, because if I get a phone call and I'm answering the phone and you don't document it, we're going to have an issue, right? So as an owner, that's great, because usually if you only have one or two people, especially if it's only one, usually that one person keeps everything, kind of in their head, and then when they leave, all of a sudden all that history and knowledge leaves with them. So when you have an offsite team, a lot of that has to be documented, which obviously as a practice owner, you want to make sure everything is inside of your software, so that even with kind of changes in your staffing, we have all the information in one place. And then again, beware of the over rotation to specialized. I'm starting to see more and more of that, where we just tend to have too many cooks in the kitchen, and it just tends to be, sometimes it's just not necessary, right? So we want to think about keeping things as simple as possible when we're able to. Okay, let's look at the time. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the digital transformation aspect. I'm by no means an IT person at all, but I do want to talk a little bit about what I'm seeing kind of from the tech perspective that I think would be helpful, especially for those that might be thinking about changing practice management softwares, or we have people on here that are starting a new practice. So when I am starting to see absolutely a shift towards the cloud, not just with the dentistry. I mean, I think dentistry is behind, and most of the other industries we're seeing are all shifting to the cloud. It allows for better systems. You don't have to have all these legacy systems. I actually don't see a lot of people investing in the old legacy system. I know, like Patterson, for example, just invested in Fuse. Most of the softwares are investing in terms of using the cloud-based platform. I'm seeing a lot more organizations really think about how to use technology to capture data and make decisions faster, right? So I haven't seen a lot of people who are still paper-based. We still have some, right? But the idea here is you can't move the needle if you have no idea where you are. So if you can build your practice in a way that can actually manage the workflow, you can see how you're doing, you can analyze it faster, you can then make decisions, I think, much more effectively, especially around workforce. I will say this, one of the things also we're doing here at Swiss Monkey is we're looking at different technology partners to figure out how to really create efficiencies within our practice. I am finding that it's kind of this really cool renaissance within the industry in terms of like all these software companies coming up, really trying to make all of our work much more efficient. One of the things I am kind of noticing is that there's not a lot of integration, right? So we have this software, but it's not integrating with this, and it becomes still very fragmented. So we're likely to see in the next few years, I think, that become much more, I think, seamless. And when you can actually have the data talk to each other, that's really where you can extract the value. But right now, I still am seeing kind of what I'm calling kind of sedimentation of technology, where you're having, maybe have one platform and you're only using 20% of the data of the capabilities of that platform. And then you're having another technology that does this really well. So you're kind of having to layer to make up for the fact that some technologies are better than others. And so we're overspending, we're having a little bit of bloat. We're probably going to see that go down as the integration becomes, I think, more seamless over the years, or whether or not those technology companies end up doing more. Okay, and I think that the area here that I'm really interested in is the automation piece. And I just saw the statistic, and it's usually between 50 to 73 is what I do. But about 60% of all occupations have at least 30% of activities that can be automated. I think that's really kind of cool in the sense that when you automate certain things, what you end up effectively doing is de-skilling a task. Right. And so that could even be, for example, in claims, we're seeing that they're actually being able to like tell people, here's what you need to put in there. Here's the stuff that has to happen so you don't get it rejected, or insurance verification that you're able to do now with kind of clicks of a button versus having to call. And so that, I think, matters for us as we are kind of in the office, because now we have to think about, all right, well, if they don't need to do these certain skills anymore in terms of like maybe calling insurance, or maybe you're off, you're offloading that, then we have to think about how do we now reskill our current workforce to be able to really utilize that technology, right? And is that something that the office does, or is that something schools do, or the government programs do? And I think there's kind of this, we're seeing this not within just dentistry, but everywhere else, where we're trying to figure out who's responsible for kind of this upskilling and reskilling of the workforce, because they say that in 2030, we don't even know what jobs we're going to need to be skilled for, all right, in terms of like what actual kind of new talent we're going to need. So I think that's something that we're going to be thinking about. But I'm seeing technology change a lot. We're seeing things get a lot more innovated, automated, not only on the clinical side, but especially on the workflow side. And that matters a lot for the practice, because that means that we have to figure out who's going to train them to be able to actually do the jobs that we need them to do in the future. I'll just mention this, and I won't get much into it, is the ability, all the automation and all the kind of the consumer side of healthcare is really interesting too, in the sense that that Gen Z, that millennial, even later on, they want a different patient experience, right? I think when I would even say 10 years ago, when we're thinking about, we used to do all the phone calls for hygiene recare, right? Of really kind of creating that rapport and that trust using phone calls and emails. We're seeing when we're doing hygiene recare, those phone calls are rarely answered. It might be very demographic specific in terms of a certain age group, but the patient experience is very different for the consumer now, especially around the hygiene side. We're seeing a lot of more people wanting to use text. They want things instantly. They want to schedule their own reservations, which you can do in certain parts, right? Maybe not for the whole office. Maybe you just do that for the hygiene side. It tends to be something I think that's going to feel much more automated, much more like when you're buying a plane ticket. You don't ever need to talk to someone. You can buy your plane ticket, check in, check out. I think the hygiene department for most offices can probably take on more of that form. Obviously, I don't think most of us want that to happen on the production side, the doctor side, but I think the patient consumer experience is going to be changing, is changing. You're seeing a lot of these kind of other kind of corporate like practices. You're seeing them being built from the ground up, using a lot of the technology to check in, check out. You're seeing a lot of more of this kiosk like infrastructure. So implications and redesigning for the future. So talked a lot about different things today. So here's kind of what I would say are my big three takeaways. One is to reassess your current talent pool. I mean, aggressively, really kind of going through and saying, okay, what is my goal in the next 5 years? I heard this kind of really interesting comment saying, hey, pretend a private equity firm just bought your practice and you want to triple your valuation in the next 5 years. How do you do that? One of those ways is to be able to really make sure you have the right people in the right places, right? And if you don't, whether or not you're going to hire them, or you're going to think about tapping into talent outside of your immediate kind of four walls. I would say be eager and open to experimenting with a hybrid model. The hybrid model is here to stay. The gig and contingent economy is, if anything, it's growing. I just saw a stat, 20 years ago, 2% of the workforce had some kind of remote workforce kind of component to their life. 10 years ago, it was 10%, and then I think in 2022 is going to be 43%. So you're just seeing kind of that gig contingent economy, that workforce to definitely grow. And I think if we can really tap into the hybrid model, we can really unlock the potential of what it can do for the dental industry. And I think thirdly, begin to build a digital and data centered infrastructure, right? That's really just more about being able to collect the data so you can act, I think, efficiently on it. All right, so this is my contact information. Cell is usually the best way. Obviously, you can always call the work number. We have a big team here, but if you ever need to get in contact with me, feel free to call or text me. Let me know a few days and times. I'm always happy to speak with you before patients, after patients, on the weekend. So whatever you need, we are here for you. So I think I'm a little ahead of schedule. I wanted to leave about 15 minutes, which is great for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. I guess now, like you said, we're going to, go through some of the questions we gathered. And, if we run out of time, we'll capture all questions and answer them and send them to you at a later time. And we have a question on the Q&A here. An anonymous attendee asked, how are you dealing with the shortage of hygienists? And actually, That's an interesting question because like I had a question of my own, just because, which was sort of related to this because, there is kind of a worker shortage in a lot of different industries. And I just was also wondering if, you've seen such in the dental field. So I guess feel free to answer both or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's interesting. I think, I would say like 5 years ago, we had this like surplus of hygienists, right? And all of a sudden with COVID, we actually saw this like, it was hard to find hygienists, especially in the Bay Area. Assistants and hygienists were hard. I would say assistants weren't as hard as hygienists, but definitely I think, especially with COVID hit, a lot of hygienists were moms, right? And parents, and a lot of them didn't come back right away. And I don't even think that even now they're fully back at the way that we are expecting them to come back. So, I've even seen some people moving in the Bay Area. I think it's really interesting because you are seeing a little bit of migration outside of the Bay. And so I'm seeing a lot of people think about, what do you do, right? Because even in our kind of wine country, we're seeing the same kind of issue, rural areas. And so it's challenging. I think we're having an industry issue, and there's only so much you can do, right? I think some of my offices are trying to pay more, right? But if your PPO fee is, if you're getting reimbursed like $100 and you're paying your hygienist like $65 an hour, after all that, it becomes almost like a break even. In some cases, you're not even making money. I have in one state, I think they were paying their hygienist $37 an hour and they're getting reimbursed $43 an hour. So it's a very, very real situation. So one of the things that we're finding also that we're having to do is really talk about the economics to hygienists. So we are seeing a lot of hygienists, I think, I wouldn't say take advantage, but I am seeing them. There's obviously it's economics, right? If there's a supply issue, they can demand more. So we are seeing that. I think traditionally what were normal kind of rates, we're seeing that kind of in maybe social forms saying, hey, I want demand this much. Right. And I think a lot of my doctors are saying, hey, do I pay this? And the real question is, I don't really think so. Unless you're going to increase your fees to be able to compensate for it, it doesn't make any sense. Right. So a couple of things some of my doctors are doing is, one, they're looking for associates to be able that are willing to, in the interim, be able to also do hygiene. I think in some cases you may be open to, I would actually either do some kind of bonus system, getting them there or after they've been there a certain amount of time, but it's a very real issue. It also depends on whether the shortage of hygienists is kind of a tricky term as well, because sometimes it's not that we're short, it's just in the Bay Area, we might be short, right? But in certain areas where there's not maybe that, the cost of living is not as high, we don't necessarily see that. I know in other states where we see that the actual cost of living is a lot more affordable, they're not having a shortage of hygienists, right? So I think it's also like the distribution of where the hygienists are. But in the Bay Area, it is still very tricky. We are filling them, actually. It's just taking a little bit longer. And I will say, when unemployment ended, we did start to see an uptick of applicants, which I'm very, very excited about. So we'll kind of see in the next 6 months here what that looks like, but it is still a very, very real issue. So if you really need to do it, you can also think about revising your schedule. You go into like maybe assisted hygiene, so you can maximize the amount of time your hygienist actually can be doing to see patients. So long-winded answer, because it's a difficult question. I wish I had a solution, but it's a little bit of everything.
Okay, cool. I think there was another question. Let me just see.
I have some about teledentistry.
Yeah, I saw that earlier. I was trying to pull it up. I guess somebody asked a question about
how to really do that. Absolutely. You can connect with me afterwards. You can teledentistry. And I got to look at the HIPAA laws, because I know with COVID, they actually, the Office of Civil Rights that kind of oversees it took out the mandate that it had to be certain types of platforms that are obviously HIPAA encrypted. And then they allowed you basically to use Zoom or things that were at least that were not open to the public. But there's lots of ways to be able, it's not actually very difficult to implement it. You can, I'll look at the law, see whether or not you can still basically use your face, kind of Zoom type applications, or whether or not you want to invest in a teledentistry specific platform. I have found that offices that will just put like virtual consults available, you can actually convert a lot of those into like patients, but it tends to be also really great for like cosmetic patients interested in cosmetics, especially some emergency patients to use teledentistry because people are reimbursing at rates that are at parity with your, your limited exams. Because when you have an emergency patient and you can see whether or not it's, there's inflammation or bleeding, you can actually then, when they come into the office, decide whether or not what type of visit it's going to be. But Michelle, absolutely happy to give you some information if you email me, and I can connect you with the right people and also show you how to set that up. It doesn't take long.
Cool. And then just want to do a quick sweep if there's any other questions. And let's see. All right. Well, it looks like that's it, Christine.
Great. So I think we're 9 minutes ahead. And so thank you, everyone. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to help. And thank you, San Mateo, for helping to host this. And I guess everyone have a great night.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us, and we hope you found the information helpful. This meeting was recorded, and it will be emailed and posted on the SMCDS Facebook page. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of your evening. All right. Bye, Christine. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.